So my paper is a little bit perhaps off topic, but I hope there we can make some bridges with what we're discussing here at the moment. My paper is entitled "Exploring Miscegenation in Vasanji's In Between World of Vikram Lal and Ronnie Govinder's Black Chin, White Chin." So today, what I'm going to be discussing is the two novels by the Tanzanian author M.G. Vasanji. The novel is entitled The In-Between Worlds of Vikram Lal. And the second author shall be Black Chin, White Chin by the South African author Ronnie Govinder. So today my central concern shall be an articulation of the cultural implications of miscegenation. And what I want to do here is I want to argue as how is a literary trope. This question represents a creative response on behalf of both authors to the question regarding the Indian ethnic presence in East and South Africa. So M.G. Vasanji has always expressed a personal anxiety as regards his status in his native Tanzania, and subsequently he went into personal exile to become a Canadian citizen. Ambiguity is the driving force behind all of Vasanji's literary production, and one can locate the seeds of this ambiguity within the triangulated relationship that existed between the African, white settler, and Indian communities. Within the East African region, the colonial administrations in Kenya, Uganda, Zanzibar, and Tanganyika all set up a three-tier racial system where the Indian population functioned as a buffer between Africans and Europeans. The British East Indian African Company, in particular, actively fomented the idea of Asians as an alien wedge. As a non-national trading class, Indians became isolated from local Africans and paid the price of being politically disengaged through their reliance on the colonial state for support. East African Indians developed an identity as a middleman within the colonial economy. The author Ojang, 2013, identifies, and I quote, endogenous South African categories came to be transformed into colonial contact zones, end of quote. Turning to the specific question of interracial sexual contact, blackness or non-whiteness was always deemed as the contaminating element within cross-ethnic relations, and here lies the pathological anxiety that one finds associated with miscegenation. The question of contamination is framed within Sarah Ahmed's 2007 article, which is based around an understanding of the space of whiteness that extends itself into places that, and I quote, have already taken their shape, end of quote, to become the absolute norm against which all other subjects must adhere. The focal point of Ahmed's argument is that the image of the white body is configured as a locus of power in comparison to the non-white body, which is always trying to negotiate space within which it never feels fully comfortable. The non-white body, Ahmed assured, is, and I quote, better described in terms of the bodily and social experience of restriction, uncertainty, and blockage. End of quote. While exploring the configuration of whiteness in comparison to the non-white body, Ahmed's main focus is on the black body. While the author does not stipulate her position, I understand the term black employed as a system of knowledge and not as an identitarian positioning based on a biological, quote, race. So therefore, the non-white body within Ahmed's configuration shares similar features with the term black in its non-essentialized form. This is useful in the untangling of the perspectives narrated both within the in-between world of Vikram Lal and Black Chin, White Chin, as regards the Indian relationship to whiteness, where the Indian body is configured as non-white. However, When one turns to other facets of the triangulated relationships within East Africa, or the complex race relationships within South Africa, the idea of the non-white body as an umbrella for difference is, I argue, more problematic. For example, in M.G. Vasanji's novel The Gunny Sack, set in Kenya, the relationship between the Indian diasporic male Danji Govanji and the African female Bibi Taratubi is a fictional representation of those interracial relationships that took place in colonial East Africa. Certainly, the diasporic Indian relationship towards whiteness, as in light of Ahmed 2007, is uncomfortable, and it's pitted against white bodies, and to quote Ahmed, would, and I quote, flow beyond their physical limits within the space, taking up more space. However, once the Indian body orients itself towards blackness, a distinct set of considerations are set into place. So here in the in-between world of Vikram Lal, Vasanji explores this disjunctive which frames the double orientation of the Asian body. The book's main character, Vikram Lal, holds an infatuation with Annie Bruce, a white settler's daughter. Set on the cups of the Kenyan independence, Annie and the entire Bruce family are slaughtered by the Mau Mau, an event that marks Vikram for the rest of his life. His fantasies of possessing the white body, dashed by the violence of the anti-colonial struggle, feeds into his already precarious situation. And here I quote from the novel. A young Asian graduate in an African country, with neither the prestige of whiteness behind me nor the influence and the numbers of a local tribe to back me, but carrying instead the stigma from a generalized recent memory of an exclusive race of brown Shylocks who had collaborated with the colonizer. Vasanji's text also explores how Asians were under a certain pressure to reconfigure their identity within the shifting post-independent power paradigm. The text references the Kenyan politician Tom Mboya, who declares at a public meeting that cross-ethnic relationships is, and I quote, a good thing for racial harmony, close quotes. This idea is contextualized in the novel through Vikram's relationship with Paul Nderi, a member of the new Kenyan elite with whom he has become intimate. Nderi wishes to draw Vikram on what he defines as, and I quote, the Asian quagmire, close quotes, by fomenting a sexual relationship between him and a black Kenyan woman. Vikram resists all of Nderi's attempts at creating these new identity affiliations through miscegenation and rationalizes his reticence by claiming his in-betweenness is his preferred state, existentialist state. His resistance not to orientate himself towards the black body, however, lies in his childhood fascination with whiteness and his subliminal desire to vicariously appropriate its power. Vikram happily maintains a dysfunctional relationship with a white Italian woman, who is in actual fact a high-class prostitute, whom the regime has put in his past in return for his services as a fixer, which will later on bring his downfall. Vikram's sister, Deepa, on the contrary, makes a conscious decision to reconfigure her identity through a romantic involvement with Ngorji, a Gikuyu. While Deepa is prepared to face down the social stigma of a sexual liaison with a black African male, it is Ngorji who resists transgressing ethnic exclusivism. This resistance is informed by his anxiety of having to face down what he perceives as the stigma of fathering a future Chodara child. And the term Chotara is a pejorative term that's used in Swahili that originally signified the offspring of Africans with Indians, but which in its contemporary configuration has been neutralized to signify any form of racial mix. So, through Ngorji's sublimated ideology of racial purity, Vasanji provides a further narrative layer regarding miscegenation. There exists a disconnect between the invitation on behalf of the new African elite to cross the colour line and Africanise identity and the actual societal realities in a post independent Kenya, which were less receptive to notions of racial hybridity. This brings me to the question of Afrocentricity. Whilst the concept of Afrocentricity has been employed by African American Afro-cultural theorists, I shall focus on Molefi Kete Ansante, 1980, who provides a specific theoretical framework for the study of African cultures and philosophies. Here, the author gives voice to a widespread concern regarding the re-evaluation of African epistemologies and ontologies by placing his focus away from Eurocentric configurations. Asante promotes the study of African culture from an African perspective and provides a holistic methodology that insists upon the interconnectedness of art, spirituality, history, and social organization when dealing with the African experience. As Africans of an Asian ethnic background, East African Indian writers were particularly concerned with this question of Afrocentricity, how this defined their identities and their connection with a place that was home, but at the same time unstable. This has been a central theme in several seminal texts, such as that of Day After Tomorrow by Bahadur Tejani and In a Brown Mantle by Peter Nazareth. Both authors examined the complexities entailed in the Asian diasporan's drive to assimilate to the national cultures of East Africa at the cusp of independence. Set in the regions of Maziland, Tanzania, Bahadur Tejani's Day After Tomorrow centers its attention on a male protagonist, Samshir, who feels emotionally suffocated by the ethos of a merchant class culture preoccupied with maintaining its economic status. Samshir rejects this in the favor of a Black Tanzanian culture which he considers to be liberating. The narrative vehicle to transmit this utopian vision is miscegenation. Samshir's relation with Naziri, a Tanzanian woman of a Ganda ethnic group with whom he has a child. Considering that, and I quote, the possibility of contact with people outside the Wepari, immediate kinship circles fills them with the dread of cultural dissolution, close quotes. And Samshir sees himself as an outlier within an East African post-independent context through his decision to reconfigure his identity through a crossing of the colour line. This crossing is transgressive in that it represents a breaking away from a restrictive and controlled sense of belonging, which is centered within the sphere of the domestic, where oftentimes anxious understandings of home are racially and ethnically marked as, and I quote, inviolable private domains to be defended from the strange world outside, which in turn has to be domesticated in order to be rid of its disturbing otherness. Specifically, the body and its relation with other bodies is closely regulated so as to, and I quote again from Ojang, forestall the risk of disturbing racial and ethnic boundaries. And it is upon women whom falls the task to surveil questions of purity and safeguard the honor of Khandanity, which is an Urdu term which signifies the extended family or lineage stretching across multiple generations. Here, there is a particular focus on a surveilling of the body and its desires. Sanchir seeks to break away from this rhetoric of domesticity and its contingent ideology of separateness within East African Indian communities. The idea that miscegenation will save the East African Indian male from isolation and cultural insignificance is underwritten by Shamsir and Naziri's boy child, who, and I quote from the text, mixed blood of two races proudly announces itself as a child of a new civilization. Close quotes. This motif of the Chotara, okay, now such as which I said before was was stigmatized, has now is set now to as a hybrid child, and which will signify what is called a new civilization. Okay, in the novel, the African world is described as idyllic, and this essentializing of East African culture can be situated within the author's affiliation with an African cultural nationalism informed by the Negritude movement of the time. Peter Nazareth in a Brown Mantle, on the contrary, problematizes the Asian adopting of an Afrocentric position as a means to embrace a new model of citizenship and to reconfigure his own masculinity. The book's protagonist, De Souza, initially believes that he can, and I quote, undo his sense of estrangement as a Goan African by renouncing Goan ethnocentrism through an active engagement in anti-colonial politics, close quotes. Yet he is neither trusted by the diasporan Goan community nor accepted by the Africans. While Day After Tomorrow explores the revolutionary potential of miscegenation, In a Brown Mantle sees it as a refuge into a fantasy world that lies outside the restrictive ethos of a diasporic Asian community within East Africa. Now, while one can draw certain similarities between East Africa and South Africa as regards their origins as transoceanic traders or indentured laborers, it is important to draw specific attention to the differences between these communities. In South Africa, there were four official racial categories, namely African, white settler, Indian, and colored, which adds a further layer of complexity to social interactions. Regarding race relationships, South African Indians were historically compromised by the policy of segregation encapsulated in the Group Area Acts. These acts signified a centralized control over the ideology of racial segregation. Areas became divided into racially segregated zones where only members of one specific ethnic group alone could live and work. These group areas were created for the exclusive occupation of a designated group, and it was a criminal offense for a member of one racial group to reside on or own land in an area set aside by proclamation for another ethnic group. This made South African Indians more politically active as a collective in comparison to East African Indians, where, and I quote, only a tiny minority of Indian political leaders actively stood up against the colonial system, close quotes. South African Indians, on the contrary, actively participated in political activities of a cross-ethnic nature, which served as a bulwark against apartheid. So, to move on to my second part of the analysis, Govinder's novel Black Chin, White Chin explores South African Indian identity through a fictionalized account of the author's real-life uncle, Chin Governor, who lives the Cato Manor suburb of Durban and commences on a journey through South Africa, which, at a deeper level, becomes a pretext to reevaluate his own Indian identity. The book's title is a clear allusion to Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks, whose main argument is that the colonial depersonalization project, the colonial depersonalizing project, became a discursive mechanism of othering which coerced the black subject into an opposition of what was white. The body is central to the subaltern predicament within a white dominated society, and the configuration of the ambiguous desire to occupy the white body was a central concern to black skin white masks. Sarah Ahmed, in this light, views the non white body as being, and I quote, shaped by histories of colonialism, which makes the world white, a world that is inherited or which is already given before the point of the individual's arrival. Ahmad is particularly inspired by how Fanon configures the black body's fraught relationship with the category of white and establishes how the privileged white body, and I quote, does not command attention and trails behind due to its quality of being neutral and thus going unnoticed. By not commanding attention or going unnoticed, Ahmad is thus referring to the ubiquitous nature of whiteness. Its privilege lies precisely in its seemingly neutral and colorless form, a form against which all other subjectivities are measured and evaluated. Black Chin, White Chin both examines the normative nature of whiteness within a South African context as set against the image of the Indian body, but also steps outside this paradigm. In light of Ahmed's configuration, we see how the protagonist, Chin, performs a mimicry of whiteness. And here we can draw a parallel with how Indo-Caribbean men also appropriated the figure of the dandy, which became, and I quote, a feminized version of hegemonic masculinity, close quotes. Chin's mimicry of whiteness through the figure of the dandy constitutes a strategy that confronts and disrupts the authority of the original. In this case, the supposed unquestionable hegemony of white authority. On the contrary to Vikram in the world of Vikram Lal, Chin's bodily orientation towards whiteness is empowering rather than debilitating. His erotic affair with his white employer, Greta Schelming, and his strategic neutralizing of ethnic difference, however, is also fraught with danger. The text evidences how, within a white-dominated society, there existed an increasingly obsession with racial categories where the Indian body had come under the surveillance and disciplinary gaze of white hegemony. From a judiciary perspective, the 1957 amendment of the 1950 Immorality Act explicitly forbade extramarital intercourse between whites and non-whites. However, even during his affair with Greta Schelming, we can detect Chin's interest in the formation of a separate and what I define as Afro-Indian identity, which has been termed by Pallavi Rastogi in her book called Afro-Indians 2008, which defines the third space of South African Asians who orient their identity towards an Afrocentric position. Chin's close friend, his co-worker Michael, a coloured who is half Xhosa and half Irish, is the first indication of this. On terminating his relationship with Greta, he initiates an intimate relationship with Michael's daughter Grace, and his sexual contact with the colored body can be seen as disturbing the binary paradigm of black-white we discussed in light of Fanon and of Ahmed. Black chin, white chin, however, also brings forth the difficulties at forging an Afro-Indian identity at the time of apartheid. And this is made evident through his refusal to treat his sexual relationship with Grace as being anything more than casual, despite the fact that they have a child together. So the text's central paradox is that while Chin has personally failed at hybridizing his identity through an Afrocentric position, his son Devanetra, who becomes an active member of the ANC and encapsulates the novel's true utopian spirit. Chin's not being able to adopt an Afrocentric position is, however, is not related to his identification with whiteness and the privileges it brings about. It has more to do with the aggressive nature of an apartheid regime that punishes racial transgressions, which is furthermore complicated by the conservative Indian community's ethos regarding miscegenation, especially where Black South Africans are concerned. And to conclude my intervention here, a close reading of The In-Between World of Vikram Lal and Black Chin, White Chin brings to light how what we discussed previously, Ahmed's and other culture theorists' configuration of the non-white body and its relationship towards whiteness needs to be contextualized. What I'm arguing here is that a separate critique needs to be put into place to understand the complexities of the triangulated racial relationships, such as those that we find in East and South Africa. So what I am saying is that one can apply cultural theorist reading of whiteness against the umbrella term black. And one of my examples is Esther Puljaras Noguer's reading of the relationship between Rahana, a Chodara girl, and Pierce, a white colonist, in Abdul Razak's text, Gurna's text, Desertion. Here, in this particular text, blackness or non-whiteness is always the contaminating element within cross-ethnic relationships. And this mirrors the pathological anxiety that one often finds associated with miscegenation. This fits perfectly with my first proposition of contamination as framed by Sar Ahmed, where the space of whiteness extends itself into spaces that have, and I quote again, have already taken their shape, close quotes, to become the absolute norm against which all other subjects must adhere. However, within the specific cultural context of the novels under appraisal in this presentation, the white body is no longer the single normative location against which the non-white body is coerced into graviating towards. The Indian, as in between in post-independence East Africa and South Africa, dramatizes a paradigmatic shift away from the category of white. This new configuration opens up other times of race relations where the white body has become decentered. And with that, I will finish my paper, and thank you very much for your time. Thank you.